Today, we will be talking about the man who has taken the UFC by storm. The man who has long hair in the back and an emo cut in the front. The man who has a scar on his throat from getting impaled by a steel object, as he put it. That's right, it is finally time to break down Diego Lopes. Like and subscribe. Diego Lopes was born December 30th, 1994, and was raised in Manaus, Amazonas, Brazil. Lopes began training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at a young age, as it was a tradition in his family to fight. Quickly began competing at the age of 7, and at 16 he received his purple belt and soon after transitioned to MMA. He currently trains out of Lobo Gym and fights in the 145-pound featherweight division. Let's stop the yapping and get right into his MMA career. Lopes had his first professional MMA fight in September of 2012, with his first opponent being Francevaldo Aravo. Lopes would smoke Francevaldo like a blunt in the hood by knocking him out at the start of the second round. So with his debut out of the way, Lopes would take his second fight in February of 2013, this time fighting Renel da Costa. This would go just as well as his debut. Lopes would knock out his opponent once again in the second round. Lopes would fight again just 2 months later in July. His opponent would be Luis Silva. Lopes wouldn't look for the knockout this time because he would take his opponent down and sink in a brutal armbar, forcing the ref to step in and stop the fight. After achieving his third finish in a row, Lopes would fight once more in November of that same year, this time facing off with Thiago Silva. This looked easy on paper, but it would be quite the opposite. It would be a very close fight that tested both men, leaving it up to the judges to decide who is the winner. And unfortunately, it was not Lopes. He would end up losing a razor-close split decision. After taking his first loss, a 19-year-old Diego would move over to Mexico and take up a job offer given to him to train some athletes. He would do this in between fights. Diego would take his next fight in April of 2014. This would be another very hard fight for Diego. Not only would he take another loss, but he would get knocked out in the second round. Things were not looking good for Diego. Not only is his record 3 wins with 2 losses, he took those losses back-to-back times. Diego would continue to train his students and fix some holes in his game. Diego would take his next fight in July of that same year, this time fighting Isaac Silva. This would go swimmingly for Lopes because in the second round he would sink in a rear naked choke and force the tap. After getting back into the win column, Lopes would take another fight to finish off the year, and that opponent would be Jose Dos Santos on the MMA Superheroes 7 card. Diego would come out guns blazing and finish his opponent in just 2 minutes into the first round, his fastest finish to date. Fun fact, this card had 2 other fighters who would eventually make it to the big leagues, those being Berna Jandaroba and Ariane Lipski, and obviously the person in this video, Diego Lopes. After getting back-to-back finishes, Diego was riding high going into the new year, and he would face off with Duda Sales in April of 2015. This would turn out to be another fantastic performance from Lopes because he would showcase his jiu-jitsu once again and sink in a career-ending heel hook and force the opponent to tap in just 3 minutes into the first round. Diego would take one more fight in September of 2015, this time fighting Gilberto Pantoja. This would get chalked down as another impressive performance from the up-and-coming Diego Lopes because he would sink in a triangle choke and get the finish. With his losses being far behind him, Diego would go into 2016 with more confidence than ever, and his first opponent would be Luis Torres in April. And once again, Lopes would come into the fight with a fire in his eyes and starch his opponent in the first minute of the first round. Lopes would take his time to train his students, as well as improve his own game, and in November, Diego would fight once again. His opponent would be Paul Marquez. Once again, Lopes would steamroll his opponent and get the submission finish in the very first round. Lopes was dominating the competition, and it wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and he would take his first fight in March of 2017 against Carlos Canada. This would be yet another walk in the park for the budding star, submitting his opponent with a rear naked choke in just 3 minutes into the first round. Lopes would take his next opponent. Lopes would take on his next opponent just 1 month in April. Lopes would take on his next opponent just 1 month later in April, this time fighting Raul Ocampo. This would be a first round finish because he would knock out Ocampo just 3 minutes into the fight. Lopes would fight a few months later in August of that same year when he would fight Isaac Ruales for the JFL featherweight belt. This would be yet another first round finish winning by rear naked choke and getting his first belt wrapped around his waist. Lopes would take the rest of the year off and enjoy the fruits of his labor, fighting again in July of 2018, fighting Amir Alzarakev. This would turn out to be a very challenging fight for Lopes because he would get knocked out in the second round, ending his great 9-fight win streak. Most would take a long time off to recover, but Lopes isn't most. He would fight again just a few months later in June, this time fighting Antonio Hernandez for the XFL featherweight belt. Diego would waste no time getting back into the win column because he would submit Antonio just 1 minute into the first round and getting his second belt wrapped around his waist in 2 different promotions. After getting his second belt, Lopes would fight just 3 months later in August against Rogelio Meneses and once again smoke his opponent like some Delta 8 in Idaho, knocking him out in just 3 minutes into the first round. Once again, Lopes would take a 3-month turnaround and fight again in October of that same year, this time fighting Luis Guerrero. Lopes would continue his first round finishing streak by submitting Luis just 1 minute into the fight. Lopes would take 5 months off and fight again in March of 2019 when he would face off with Ronnie Becerra. This would be a hard fight, but Lopes would remain the winner, this time winning by decision. Lopes would fight again for the belt, this time in the Lux Fight League. His opponent would be Alejandro Rodriguez. This would turn out to be his longest fight to this point, going all 5 rounds and testing Diego's cardio like never before, but he would still end up on top and achieve his 3rd belt in 3 different promotions. His next fight would be in November of 2019. He would attempt to get his first title defense. The title challenger would be Marco Beltran. Lopes would go back to his finishing ways by sinking in a slick knee bar and force the tap in the very first round, getting his belt wrapped around his waist once again. Lopes would end up taking his longest layoff in his career due to the illness that shut down the world, eventually fighting again in March of 2021, attempting his second title defense against Maceo Fullen. This would turn out to be a tougher fight than expected, but as usual, Lopes would get the finish in the 3rd round and win by submission. All of these finishes would finally get the attention of the big man Dana White, and they would offer him a fight on the widely respected show, Dana White's Contender Series. His opponent would be Joe Anderson Brito, and on August 31st, 2021, Lopes would get the opportunity of a lifetime. This would turn out to be a very hard fight for Lopes. This would be a very hard fight for Lopes, which would end up to be a technical decision loss for Diego Lopes. After falling short of getting to fight in the UFC, Lopes would fight in Fury FC. Just a few months later in October, his opponent would be Nate Richardson. This was for the belt as well, but unlike all of his previous fights, this would be a hard-fought fight that ended up with Lopes on the wrong end of a split decision. Once again, he had lost 2 fights in a row, but he would never stop getting up after he fell down. Lopes would fight again in February of 2022, this time facing off with Ken Glenn, and he would jump right back into the win column and get the finish he was known for. A knockout in the last 21 seconds into the fight. A knockout in the last 21 seconds of the fight. Lopes would take his time to fight again and wait until November to make his well-known walk once again. His opponent would be Angel Rodriguez. This would turn out to be an easier fight for Lopes, knocking his opponent out in just 40 seconds into the 2nd round. Although Diego Lopes lost his fight on the Contender Series, Lopes would get the call from the UFC to fight a monster in the UFC, Movsar Evloev. This was akin to sending a lamb out for slaughter, especially if you consider the fight would have to be taken on short notice. But Lopes was never known to back down from a tough fight. He would accept this opportunity. Many people thought Lopes would get finished in the 1st round because many weren't aware of how good he really is. And in May of 2023, Lopes would make his UFC debut. This would be a back and forth scrap that had fans stunned at how competitive this fight was. But Evloev would end up getting the unanimous decision win. However, fans were impressed with Lopes. Not only did he challenge Evloev more than any other opponent had to that point, but some thought he should have even won. So the UFC were eager to see how this new fighter would fare against other fighters. So the UFC would offer Lopes another fight in August of that same year against Gavin Tucker, and this is where the fans would see how good Lopes really was, because Lopes would steamroll Tucker and sink in an armbar and get the submission win in just 90 seconds into the 1st round. After getting his first win under the UFC banner, Lopes would waste no time fighting again in November of 2023, going up against Pat Sabatini, and Lopes would not disappoint because he would run through Pat in just 90 seconds, knocking him out in devastating fashion. This would line him up to be on one of the best cards in UFC history, facing off with Sadiq Youssef on the massive UFC 300 card. On the biggest stage the UFC had seen in years, with many people feeling like Lopes might get knocked out by the heavy hitter. It made for an interesting matchup, and the fight would commence. Lopes would show up and show out and put on a masterclass, once again getting a 90-second knockout and shocking the fans. After getting 3 finishes in a row and getting into the rankings, Lopes would get the fight with the number 3 contender Brian Ortega, and in June of this year he would make that walk, but Brian would pull out last minute, and there was another veteran begging for a chance to beat the rising star, Dan Ige. This was a fight that was made on the same day of the fights. Many people felt like Diego would get another first round knockout, but this would turn out to be a fantastic fight with both guys trading shots and testing how good Diego's boxing really was. This fight would get left to the judges, and Lopes would be awarded with another unanimous decision victory. After getting the win and staying in the rankings, Lopes would still want to fight Ortega and prove to the promotion that he is one of the best fighters in the division. And on September 14th, 2024, this previous weekend, he would be one of the few fighters to fight in the Las Vegas sphere and participate in being the first sport event to take place in the new arena. And this fight would not disappoint. Lopes would almost be the first fighter to knock out Ortega in the first round, but Ortega would showcase his chin and his heart, not only surviving the first round, but at times he was landing on Diego clean. But Diego landed the harder shots and dropped Ortega multiple times, and left Ortega with an eye that was swollen shut and walked out with a unanimous decision victory. After his hard fight, Lopes is still a coach, and he would be in Alexa Grasso's corner in the very next fight. That's how much of a savage this man is. Now he is ranked number 3 on the short list of fighters who might be able to fight the winner of Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway for the UFC featherweight belt. Lopes is currently 29 years old with 26 wins and 6 losses. He has 10 knockouts, 12 submissions, and 4 decision wins. He has been knocked out 2 times and has lost 4 decisions. He has 6 knockouts in the first round and 9 submissions in the first round as well, with both of his knockout losses being in the second round. Overall, I do think Lopes has the potential to become champion, but he does leave himself open to counters when he throws shots, and he has been knocked out 2 times in the past. If he keeps improving and sharpening up his defense and improves his cardio, he could become champion one day. However, it is important to remember that many fighters don't reach their prime until 31 to 34 years old, so we still have a few years before we see Lopes at his very best. Comment below if you think Lopes will ever become champion. If you watched the video this far, be sure to like and subscribe, as it is the only way to support the channel. I hope you guys have a great week and enjoy the fights. Bye.